Well, thanks very much. Yes, and here we are at the LSE, and some of you may be economists. But it's very hard for people who are not economists to understand how powerful, the immense power economics has in shaping public policy. Not just on economic issues, but on social issues, completely across the board. Just as an illustration, the British government, and it's not alone in this, employs 1,500 economists. Now, what do they all do? Now, if you're not an economist, you might think they work in the central bank, the Bank of England, or the finance ministry, the treasury. Some of them do, but they are everywhere. Most of them are not in the central bank and treasury doing the things you think economists do. They're there, and they have a shared vision of how the world works. And when you see the disputes in economics on the television and the media, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Below that is a massive iceberg and a shared view amongst economists of how the world operates. And all policies have to be filtered through this view. It's got enormous power in shaping policies. And it's a scientific view, it's a scientific theory of how people behave, how they take decisions. And from that flows a particular view as to how policy should be conducted. I'm going to come on in a few minutes to give an example of how that led to some disastrous failures in the run-up to the crisis. So like any scientific theory, it makes simplifications, it makes assumptions. And it makes some key assumptions. First of all, when people are taking decisions, when you're selecting amongst a group of alternatives, you do so in isolation. You're sat there like Robinson Crusoe's on your island, and society might as well not exist. You yourself already have in your mind a fixed set of tastes and preferences amongst the alternatives that are available. And your task is to gather information on these alternatives, all the attributes, the objective attributes of these, compare them to your fixed tastes and preferences, and then take the best possible decision for you. Take the one which is closest to your tastes and preferences. So the view of policy that this leads to is to say, well, if we actually want to alter behaviour, we should change as policymakers the attributes, the properties of the alternatives. And one of these will say be price, so we might want to change the tax rate. We might want to give people a subsidy to move into a depressed area. We might want to change a regulation to change the incentives, the costs and benefits of doing something. So it's a view of how we actually operate policy, of people operating in isolation, and if we want to change their behaviour, we actually change incentives. But I think increasingly, it's not wrong, but increasingly the world is becoming dominated by a different phenomenon. That increasingly we take decisions depending not on a fixed set of preferences, we observe what other people do, and our preferences are altered, they evolve over time. We're linked together across networks, and it's these which are the driving force of a great deal of our behaviour. So I'm an economist, so I better have a model to illustrate my theme. And here we are. Now, some of you, this is Coco Rocha, one of the most famous supermodels in the world. And now a couple of American academics actually studied the major fashion shows across the world for a whole year and observed how many times people appeared. And in this particular year, Coco was the number one. She appeared 55 times. And the next one was something like 30. And there were about 20 which appeared in more than 20. There were about 50 which appeared in 6 to 20. And there were 677 who appeared in only 1 to 5. And the academics went on to actually compare the attributes of the models. Not just the measurable ones, but things like hair colour, eye colour, this sort of thing. And what they found was there was no difference between those who'd been very successful and, if you like, the market as a whole. The attributes were identical. We couldn't distinguish the ones which were highly successful on the basis of the particular attributes. So we think, how could this have happened? Well, first of all, you have the first show. Let's just imagine as a theory that in the first show in the year, the models are selected at random. Then in the second show, when people are coming along to make a decision as to who to have to appear, they look and see, and in some way they become badged. Your choices at the second show are influenced by the fact you somehow think, even though there may be no objective difference, you convince yourselves that there are because these have already appeared. So in some way they must be different. There must be something special about them. So we get these self-reinforcing effects taking place. Let's just think of a more mundane one. Now, there might be people, I'm sure there are people here who can actually distinguish the attributes of these products and behave like economists think. There will be people here who can go away and actually say, yes, this does this, yes, this does that, this does that. I can't, and I can tell you most people can't. How do I choose my smartphone? I go into the office, ask a couple of young people, how's your phone? Does it work? How do you switch it on? And they said, yes. I said, all right, I'll have one of those. That's how I took my decision. And that's how an awful lot of people decide amongst these very high-tech products. But it's not just very high-tech products, because we now see, and this is something which has happened relatively recently, it's happened in my lifetime, just a vast proliferation of choices that are available. Now, the next slide, I'm just going to put some numbers up. It just happens to be some data I've got for Germany about the proliferation of choice in certain products. Here we have. Now, SKU is a technical term, means stock keeping unit. It's the level at which retailers restock. When the shelves are empty, they phone up the manufacturers or whatever and say, we want so many of these. So mid-range laptops, I've just mentioned there's other examples here, in Germany, that's no different. Mid-range laptops, 3,500 different specs. Now, you could, and there may be people who do this, go away and compare all these attributes. But that's not a rational way to behave in a market like this. And think how many markets are like this. The rational way is to ask a few people whose opinion you trust, form that, and actually go away and buy the same thing. Now, these are in consumer markets. But let's think about how this particular view of people operating in isolation from each other with fixed tastes and preferences had some really quite disastrous consequences. Here's a financial market. In the run-up to the crash, there was a huge amount of work carried out both by the banks themselves and by the regulatory bodies, not just in the UK, but across the world, in assessing the risks that the banks faced. Now, this was all very sophisticated and highly mathematical, but it had a fundamental problem, which some policymakers now do appreciate. The risks were assessed on a bank simply on its own portfolio. Now, what was the risks of the assets and liabilities that it held? And the idea of a systemic risk, the idea that risk could cascade, and there could be a cascade of bank failures across the world, was not part of the regulatory structure. And that was what the whole panic was about. In the autumn of 2008, when Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail, the regulators then understood for the first time that actually might trigger a massive cascade of bank failures. And we'd be back in the 1930s, in the really Great Depression. I mean, this has been bad enough this time round, when output has fallen something like 5% in the recession. In the 1930s, it fell 25%, 5 times as much. That was catastrophic, and they had bank failures. And so this view of individuals operating in isolation led to a massive policy error in terms of the run-up to the financial crisis. Let's think of some other things. Just at the moment, economic recession and recovery. What sort of policy should we have? There's a big debate about this. Should we have austerity or not? But an awful lot of this doesn't depend upon objective circumstances. It depends much more on narrative, about how things are perceived across networks. Let me just give an illustration. That some of you may have picked this up. A few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, there was a big fuss in the newspapers because the British government debt, its quality was downgraded a notch. But if we look at the rate of interest the British government has to pay to borrow to service its debt, it's about 2%. Then in Spain, it's been 7 or 8%. It's catastrophic for Spain, catastrophic for Greece that have to borrow even bigger rates. But if we look at the objective attributes of the public sector finances, Britain and Spain are virtually identical. If we look at how big the debt is compared to the size of the economy, there's virtually no difference. And yet somehow, across the market networks of opinion, it's been perceived that Britain is somehow sound and the Spanish are unreliable. So, that's narrative. That's not policy. That's not interest rates. That's not sophisticated macroeconomic theory. That's who can get their story across. And in the current situation, an awful lot depends amongst confidence amongst firms, how they perceive the future, how certain they are. There's a vast pile of cash sitting amongst the big companies here, in the rest of Europe and in the United States. They've accumulated, the big companies accumulated huge cash reserves, but hardly any of them are spending because they're all watching each other and waiting to see for other people to spend. And this is a big challenge. How do we trigger that and that people actually start to spend rather than just sit on these cash reserves? Worklessness, yes, I've lived in Richmond for many years, originally from Lancashire, and from a town called Rochdale, which has been notorious for the last few years because every February there's a survey published of the local area with the biggest proportion of workless people in the country. It's always been a particular estate in Rochdale. 84% are on some form of benefit. And yet just down the road, 1 or 2 miles away, very similar estates, very similar public sector housing schemes, the worklessness rate is 20-30%. And a lot of this is down to social values. If everybody else on your estate is not going to work, you're encouraged to do the same, regardless. So the idea, the cure of saying, well, we'll simply cut benefits and change the incentives, make it more profitable to go to work, it'll have some impact, but if the dominant culture is not to do that, it's not going to get you very far. It's looking at the problem the wrong way around. Let's think about health issues, binge drinking, obesity, smoking. Well, as a student, of course I drank large amounts on occasions, especially, being a rugby player. But now, this is an entirely new phenomenon. And in particular, the idea that young women go out and drink just stupendous amounts. Now, it's because of peer acceptance. It didn't used to be the case. This was, even amongst young people, this was frowned upon. It wasn't socially acceptable. It wasn't a question of availability of alcohol or its price. It was quite cheap in those days. Well, when I was a lad, you could buy anything for tuppence halfpenny, but it's become socially acceptable across the network. The values have changed. Obesity. It's not that people say, yes, I'll go out and eat a pizza. I see somebody fat, I want to copy them, so I'll go out and eat 10 pizzas. But it becomes acceptable in a way which wasn't the case, even 20 or 30 years ago in certain communities. And so the idea that we can change, incentives may have some role to play, but we need to unlock the power of networks and of values to really make a difference. So this whole range of examples, health, worklessness, economic recoveries, and recessions. And policy increasingly in this world is much more about stories and persuasion across networks, altering values, altering tastes and preferences, rather than assuming that they're fixed and that you can fine-tune them by changes in tax rates, changes in benefits or subsidies. They have a role, but these are policies of the 19th and 20th century. They are not the ones which will succeed in the 21st. Thanks very much.